All right, just a quick agenda for today. So I just want to say that many of you are just joining us for the first time, but I know there are a few people who joined us for Monday's Beginner Users Workshop. And just a note to those people that a lot of the things we're going to be talking about today are repeats of that. So we will be talking about some new things later on the workshop, but if you're joining us again after Monday's workshop, thanks for your patience, and a lot of this will be repeat. So we will start off by taking a tour of the QGreenland data package and talk a little bit about the project and the inspiration for it, and then what's included in the download package. And then we'll actually go to QGIS and explore how to use some of the tools in the QGIS processing toolbox to analyze and query QGreenland data sets. We'll also look at how to edit existing data layers, create new data layers from scratch, and import new data sets into a QGreenland project. And then we'll take some time to talk with our QGreenland developers about some more advanced development topics, like how to make your data compatible with QGreenland, contributing to the project, and any questions you might have for the developers. We'll take some time for a Q&A there as well. Then we'll talk very briefly about plugins, and we will do an example of how to import GPS data with a data set. And finally, we'll learn how to create a map for printer publication with QGreenland, and finish up with a little bit of a group work, of group projects at the end. So that's what we're looking at today. All right, so I'm here with the entire QGreenland development team. So I'm going to ask them to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll get going after that.
Hi, everyone. I'm Twyla Moon. I'm the project lead for QGreenland and deputy lead scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center. Thrilling to see everyone. You, of course, get the whole team since it's our first beginner and intermediate workshops. Sadly, I will be leaving a bit before the end of the workshop's over, but everyone will be in good hands the whole time. I'll pass that over to Matt.
Hey, I'm Matt Fisher. I've been at NSIDC as a software developer for about 5 years now, working on QGreenland for the last year. I'm going to be wearing a because I have some work being done on my house, and you may hear a little bit of noise when I'm talking about, so I apologize in advance for that.
I'm Trey. I've been working with Matt as a software developer also for about 5 years at NSIDC, working on QGreenland from the beginning. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have that come up over the course of the workshop.
And again, I'm Lynn. I'm the education and evaluation specialist on the team. And I've been working, I do education outreach currently for the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I've been working in education and outreach for almost a decade now, but I'm actually a coastal geologist by training, and use GIS extensively in my PhD research, looking at coastal processes in California and Alaska. So again, it's really great to have you all here. And I do want to say before we move on that because this is the Experienced Users Workshop, I'm sure there's a lot of you that have a lot more knowledge than we do. And so I really want us to think of this as a collaborative knowledge sharing experience. If anything comes up and you have some knowledge to share, feel free to put it in the chat box so we can all learn from each other. All right. So I'm going to actually pass it back to Twyla to tell us a little bit more about QGreenland.
Thanks, Lynn. For those of you who haven't already been feeling you've heard too much from me, maybe on Twitter about QGreenland, if you are coming from a place where you're a researcher interested in both poles, you might already be familiar with Quantarctica, which is a QGIS package for Antarctica, and that tool put together by the Norwegian Polar Institute is beloved, and there have been many requests to have something for Greenland. Certainly, I was one of those requesters, and we were really lucky to find interested funding from the National Science Foundation EarthCube program that emphasizes good data practices, data management, data dissemination. And we're now kind of roughly halfway through a grant period of developing the QGreenland tool with the version 1.0 that's out that all of you will be using today. We're a little bit different from Quantarctica for folks familiar with that. QGreenland is built entirely as a kind of open platform. So all of the code that builds QGreenland is on GitHub and is open source and available for folks to leverage in creating modifications or entirely new instances of QGreenland packages, or also getting involved directly in development if you're a person who likes that sort of thing. It's designed to be a curated package of interdisciplinary data. So we're in no way a complete data package, but we've found a few partners. For example, the National Science Foundation Arctic Data Center has helped us in creating a Greenland geospatial data portal over there to identify their more than 550 geospatial data sets that include data in Greenland. So the tool is meant to be downloadable, usable offline so that you can travel to the field and you're going to have all of the parts of QGreenland package, and you're also going to have all of the really skill, depth, strength that comes with QGIS. So much more advanced kind of analysis tools at your fingertips for you to use as you'd like. And the hope is that it's really useful for scientists, educators, and others. And we've been trying to develop tools so that people who have never used GIS can step into using QGreenland. Of course, you're all arriving here with an understanding that you know a bit about GIS, and that opens up that many more tools. Because we're still under development, lots of space for improvements, to hear from the community. Our entire purpose is to make this a tool that you want to use and you want to share. And so we are always all ears for your questions, suggestions, and ideas. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Twyla. All right, so I wanted to just do a quick overview of what's included in the QGreenland download package. Some of you may have actually looked at this extensively already, and some of you may have downloaded it today for the first time. So just so we're on the same page. And also before I mention that too, I'll just say that I am currently running all of my programs on a Mac OS. And so a lot of things that you see might be different from what you see on your own computer. For example, when we switch to QGIS here, that might look a little different for you than it does for me, just to be aware. All right, so the first thing that I want to draw your attention to are we have many, many data layers included in the QGreenland download package, and they're all organized by topic. So all of these parent folders have within them many data layers related to the topics. And when we go and look at the QGreenland project file in QGIS, you'll notice that they're all also organized the same way there. So these main folders become the main group layers in QGIS, with all of the other individual data layers within them, the subgroups or the sublayers within those larger group layers. So be sure to just make sure you kind of see the organization of these things, and feel free to look through these folders to understand the data sets that are within them. To get a really quick overview of all of the data layers that are included in the QGreenland download package, there is a CSVS spreadsheet of all of those data layers just listed out, and more information about each of them. So it's just a really easy way to easily scan through all of the layers included in the download package. We also included an extensive user guide, and a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, in fact, all of what we're going to be talking about today, and then some, is included in that longer user guide. And in addition to that, we also created a shorter quick start guide for folks who are pretty familiar with GIS already. There is a document in the download package that includes information on how to contribute to the QGreenland project. And again, we'll be talking more about that later on in the workshop with our QGreenland developers. There's also a document with more information on how to make your data compatible with QGreenland, some guidelines around that. And then finally, we have the main QGreenland GIS project file. And I recommend that if you haven't already opened this, go ahead and do so, since we're going to actually be using this here in a second to look more at the QGreenland data in QGIS and do some data analysis on this. So feel free to open that up if you haven't already. I do want to mention too that for all of the data layers included in the QGIS or the QGreenland download package, there are both vector and raster data sets. All of our vector data sets are geo-packaged data layers, and all of our raster data sets are GeoTIFF. And like Twyla mentioned, most of these data layers are available offline, but we do have some that are online access only because of their size. And you'll see that when we switch over to QGIS. All right, before we move on, since I know not everybody has had a chance to really look at the download package, I just wanted to pause and give everyone about 3 or 5 minutes or so to take some time and really explore the download package. So again, feel free to look through those data layers and familiarize yourself with the organization of them. Since there's a lot of them and we're going to be using them today to do analysis, it's good just to have familiarity of about where everything is. So take about 3 to 5 minutes and then we'll come back together and keep going. All right, so hopefully you've had a chance just to become more familiar with what's in the data package and the different data layers. The next thing I want to do before we really dive into the data is to do just a really quick review of some basic QGIS things. I know this is the Experienced Users Workshop, but just to make sure we're all on the same page and there's no question about the things I'm referring to, really quick review of the GIS interface. So we have the status bar on the bottom here, which tells us information such as the coordinate reference system of our project and the location of our mouse on the map view. The map view is where we look at the main view for all the data layers that are currently toggled on or visible in the layers panel. And again, your interface might be a little bit different depending on how you've customized it or what operating system you're running. On the left-hand side, I have a couple of panels visible here. So this bottom one is the layers panel. When I actually moved to QGIS, this is the only panel I will have open on the left side. But the top is a browser panel. So again, this is just an easy way to access different files that you might want to add or project files on your computer. And then of course on the top here and on the side, these are the different toolbars. We'll be using these extensively. So you'll want to make sure you have toolbars like the map navigation toolbar turned on there. And then on the top, our menu bar. Also, just a really quick review of the different kinds of data layers in QGIS, since we'll be looking at these more extensively and doing some data analyses and queries with the processing toolbox with these data layers. So vector data layers are discrete layers, discrete points, lines, or polygons. We have lots of vector layers in the QGreenland download package. So just to show you an example of each of these layer types here, one point layer, vector layer type we have in QGreenland is called towns and settlements. So this very much is exactly what it sounds like, a list of towns and settlements in Greenland. In the middle here, an example of a line vector layer in the QGreenland data package are land streams. So again, each of these individual lines has a set of attributes associated with it that one can access through the attribute table, the same with the points. And then on the far right here, an example of a polygon vector layer in QGreenland are bird protected areas. And just like lines and points, each of these polygons has associated attributes that we can access through the attribute table. And I'll just remind us how to do that here in a second. So this is an example of what an attribute table for one of our QGreenland data layers looks like. This is the attribute table for a data set of birds, the common murre. So these are common murre colonies from 2010. And just to remind you, so the columns are the various attributes we have listed for these data, and then the rows are the different features, so the different colonies. And I just want to point out too that for a lot of these attributes, it will be pretty obvious what they mean. You might run across a few in QGreenland where it's not so obvious what that attribute is. And a way you can find that out is to go to the layer properties. All of these data sets have full metadata and information associated with them that will provide more insight into what these different attributes mean. And if that doesn't help, we also provide a link to the original data source, which is another place that you can go and find more information about the data and the attributes. And the second type of data layer that we've included in QGreenland are raster layers. So again, these are continuous data layers composed of pixels or cells of a certain size organized into a regular grid. And of course, the smaller the grid, the smoother the look. So here are just 3 examples of raster data sets we've included in the QGreenland project. So on the left here, this is a data set of permafrost probability with a 10-kilometer grid cell size. So you notice that it's fairly pixelated because of the large grid cell size. In the middle here, this is another data set we've included called geothermal heat flux with a slightly smaller grid cell size. And then on the far right, a Greenland image mosaic from 2019 of the very high resolution. And we have several other raster layers included in the QGreenland data package. All right. So I'm actually going to switch over to the QGIS interface. So feel free to do the same. And I do want to say that when you open your own QGreenland project file, it might look like this. It might mean different, or it might look different. When I open the QGreenland project file directly, I don't actually see anything in the map view. So I end up having to just zoom to the data layers using the toolbar or right-clicking on one of the data layers in the panel. Like I said, you might actually open it and have all of the data in view, but just in case you don't, know there's a quick fix for that. All right, so again, here on the left in the layers panel is a list of all of the QGreenland data layers included in the download package. And again, you'll notice that the organization of these is very much similar to the organization of the folders. So all of these are group layers, and you can expand these to see the individual layers within those group layers. And just a quick reminder too, that of course, these are organized in order of the view in the map view. So those on the top are going to show up first or on top in the map view. Those in the bottom will be on the bottom. So if you have a layer toggled on and you can't see it, just know that you can move it around or untoggle, turn off layers on the top to be able to see the layer that you want to see. Also, a quick reminder, I mentioned layer properties. If you want to see the layer properties for any of these QGreenland data layers, quick and easy way to do that is to right click on the layer you're interested in. And then scroll down to properties, and that'll bring up your properties window. And as I mentioned too, if you look at the information and metadata tabs here, that lists all of the information for each of our data layers. To access attribute tables for any of the vector layers, similar process, so I'll do the same for the same layer. Right click, open attribute table, and that'll bring up all the attributes for that particular layer. All right, so I'm going to stop here again and actually give everybody a chance to explore the data layers in QGreenland in the QGIS interface. So we'll take about 2 or 3 minutes again for you just to explore how these are organized, and go ahead and set it up so that your map view is the way that you want it, or make sure that your interface is customized the way that you want it. A reminder that you can move around all of these toolbars and the layer and the panels so that the interface is customized to however you'd like it to be. So take a few minutes, customize your interface, explore the data layers, and then we'll come back together and move on. And also before we do that, I just want to mention too, you'll probably want, well, generally you would want to save your work often, since QGIS can crash here and there. But I would recommend saving it with a different file name so that you don't overwrite the main QGIS project file. All right, so take a couple minutes and then we'll come back. All right. So in this next part, I want to show you some of the ways that you can analyze QGreenland data using the tools in the QGIS processing toolbox. So we aren't going to be doing anything very complicated with these tools, but this is just to give you a flavor of what you can do with the different data sets. And because there are so many data layers in the QGreenland data package, this will just help you to become even more familiar with what those are. And what information that you can have access to. So the first example that I want to do is to try to use the processing toolbox to answer the question, which populated regions in Greenland have more than 5,000 people? And again, I encourage you to do the exact same steps that I'm doing in this example or in all of these examples that I'll be doing. And just a note too, that if you go to the shared Google Drive folder, there is a document in that folder that lists all of the detailed steps for all of the examples that we'll be talking about in today's workshop. And so if you have not so much experience with the processing toolbox, or you sort of lose us in the process of doing these examples, feel free to go to that document and you can follow along with the steps there too. Okay, so back to QGIS. Again, our question is, how many populated places in Greenland have more than 5,000 people? So the processing toolbox, if you're not familiar with it, an easy way to open the processing toolbox is to use this gear icon. Click on this gear button, and this is in the attributes toolbar. So if you don't see this button here, that means your attributes toolbar isn't turned on. An easy way to do that is to right click in the toolbar area and just double check that it's toggled on. So I'm going to go ahead and open my processing toolbox. And again, the processing toolbox is really what makes QGreenland or QGIS a powerful geospatial data analysis tool. So these are all various tools and functions that we can use to query and analyze data. So for this particular example, how many populated places in Greenland have more than 5,000 people? Since populated places is one of our vector layers, just to point you to where that layer is, that's in the places group layer within the community map crowdsource sublayer. So if you don't have populated places toggled on, go ahead and do so. That's the layer we're going to be using for this example. And to figure out the answer to this question, we are going to be using a tool within the vector selection group of tools in the processing toolbox. So feel free to expand that. And then we're going to be using the tool called Select by Attribute. All right, for our input layer, so this list here will have all of the vector layers available in QGreenland. So it's a very, very long list, but they're all listed by alphabetical order. So we're going to go to the populated places layer and choose that as our input layer for this particular function. And then because we're interested in the population, the number of people in this case, we're going to make our selection attribute population. For the operator, since we're interested in the number of populated places with more than 5,000 people, we'll make the operator greater than, and then type in 5,000 into the value box. And then I'm going to leave this last piece here, modify current selection by, as the default, creating new selection, and click run. There's a couple of different ways that we can review the results. So one way that we can review the results is if you start to zoom in, you'll notice that there are different populated places, different towns that are highlighted, for example, right here. So that tells us that's one of the populated places that was selected. But perhaps an easier way to do this is to go to our attribute table. So I'm going to open the attribute table for our populated places data set. And then whatever places were selected using this tool should be highlighted in the table. And an easy way just to pull those to the top is to go down to this button in the lower left-hand corner For me, it currently says show all features. I'm going to click on that and change it to show selected features. And that should just bring the populated places into view that I have more than 5,000 people. And I'm sure all of you know that there is always more than one way to do something in QGIS. And George brings up a great tip in the chat that there's just another way that you can do a similar function to this using different tools in the processing toolbox. And that's certainly true for a lot of what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to deselect these so that they're no longer highlighted by just clicking on deselect all up here at the top of the attribute table and close it. Okay, so let's look at a different example. So if you've looked in some more detail at some of the data layers included in the QGreenland data package, you'll notice that there are many data sets that include data that extend outside of QGreenland, so outside of the QGreenland border and boundaries. This is just one example of a data layer that does that. So this is another bird layer, thick-billed mirror colonies from 2010. And so in addition to having data about colonies in Greenland, there is also data sets in Canada, Iceland, and Svalbard. It might be the case that you really just care about the data that's within Greenland. After all, this is called QGreenland. And so you might actually want to get rid of or just extract, isolate the data sets that are in Greenland. So I'm going to show you one way that you can do that. So back to QGIS. And we're going to actually use that same thick-billed mirror colony data set. So I'm going to turn off populated places here. And then our bird data sets are all under the biology group layer. So if you expand that, we can turn on thick-billed mirror colonies 2010. So one way to extract just the colonies that are in Greenland and not in the surrounding land masses is to use this tool under vector selection called extract by location. So for this tool, I want to extract features from our thick-billed mirror colonies 2010 layer. So I'll go ahead and enter that for our extract features from layer. And then I'm going to skip this middle part for here for now and go down to where it says by comparing to the features from. So we have a data set in the QGreenland data package that is just the QGreenland boundaries or border. And that one is called Greenland Coastlines 2017. So I'm going to scroll up to that data layer. So right here, Greenland Coastlines 2017. I'm going to choose that as the layer to compare the features from. And to basically cover my bases, I'm going to select all of the boxes that I think are relevant for this example. So I really want to find all of those thick-billed mirror colony layers or data sets that are intersecting, touching, or within the Greenland boundary. If you wanted to save this as a permanent layer, you certainly can. I'm just going to leave that default for now and create it as a temporary scratch layer and click run. So that extracted layer will show up in your layers panel. For me, it showed up in a place I don't want it to be because I think I had the places group layer highlighted at the time that I ran this tool. So I'm actually going to move this layer down underneath thick-billed mirror colonies since that's what it is. So I'm going to click and drag it down here. And then I'm also going to change the symbology of this because I want to make this a more apparent point. So I'm going to open up our layer properties and just modify its symbology to make it a little more obvious. There we go. And of course, this is not a very descriptive name, so you can always change the name of any layer by right-clicking and selecting Rename Layer. But I'm going to leave it as this for now. All right, so let's look at how that algorithm did. So I'm just going to toggle on and off the thick build mirror colonies original layer and that extracted layer. And you'll notice it did a fairly good job of just extracting the colonies that are in Greenland and getting rid of all of the other layers that are outside of Greenland. However, you might notice that it didn't get everything. So I'm just going to zoom in here and show you that there's actually a couple of places, for example, right here, where that tool did not get one of the locations we needed it to. And if you zoom really far in, you'll see that because this particular data point doesn't intersect or is not at all contained by the Greenland Coastlines 2017 layer. And that's because there is, of course, uncertainty and error in some of these data layers. So there is a fix for this. And that's by creating a buffer around this coastlines layer that extends out far enough to capture this data point. So I'll show you how to do that. Before we do that though, I always like to decide ahead of time what that buffer distance is going to be. And one way that you can use that is by using the measurement tool in the toolbar. So this measurement tool is in the same toolbar as the processing toolbox. And you can measure anything from lines to areas to angles, but we're going to measure a line because I'm just curious about the distance between the data sets or the points that were not captured by that last algorithm and the Greenland Coastlines 2017 layer. So we can click on the measurement tool button. That'll bring us up a little dialog box that will show us measurements. I'm going to change this to kilometers. And then I can measure that distance by just clicking on that data point I'm interested in and then moving my mouse around. That'll draw a line. That'll tell me the distance between the coastlines layer and that data point that wasn't selected. So I'll just let you know that the buffer distance that we'll want to choose for this particular example to capture all of the data points that were missed by the extract by location tool is 10 kilometers. All right, so how do we create a buffer around that coastlines layer? So that tool is found under the vector geometry category in the processing toolbox and is, of course, called buffer. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that buffer tool. For our input layer, we'll want to choose the Greenland Coastlines 2017 polygon layer. So I'll go ahead and choose that. And then I mentioned that the buffer distance that we want is 10 kilometers. So I'll go ahead and make sure that that's input here in the distance box. And I'm going to leave everything else default here. All right, we'll click run. And this one takes a little bit longer for me, so it might take a little bit longer for you to run as well. All right, so hopefully your map looks a lot like mine. Now you should see this buffer around the Greenland coastline. That is a 10-kilometer buffer. If you zoom in, you can kind of see what that looks like. And that buffer should encapsulate those thick build mirror colony points that were not extracted initially when we use the extract by location tool. So we're actually going to repeat that analysis using this new buffered coastline layer instead of the original one to hopefully extract all of those data points we're interested in. So I'm going to go back to this extract by location tool and then just redo that. So again, I'll use the thick build mirror colonies 2010 point layer as our input layer. And then now I want to compare to the features from this buffered layer. So this is already here for me. I'll just leave it as is. Check the appropriate boxes. And then run that. And then I'm going to turn off this buffered layer just so we can see everything okay. And I'm going to change this new extracted symbology to be a little bit different, just so we can distinguish everything. And if you look closely, you'll notice that some of those colonies that were not extracted in the initial example we did with just the coastlines layer were with the buffered coastlines layer. So that's, again, just an example of how to extract data just within Greenland for data layers that extend outside of Greenland. And if you have any issues doing that because of uncertainty in the coastlines layer, you can certainly buffer the layer, and that often helps. Are there any questions so far about anything? Feel free to throw them in the chat if there are. All right, so I'm just going to pause here and give you a chance to play around with the processing toolbox with some of the vector tools, and then I'll come back and show you some examples of using some raster analysis tools in this toolbox. But I do have some example tasks that you should feel free to do if you'd like some guidance on how to practice with these vector tools. So I just want to draw your attention to the Google Drive folder that I mentioned earlier that has some resources and documents and other things in there that you can access. I'll put this link in the chat so you can get to it directly if you're not already there. And let me know, of course, if you have any trouble accessing this folder. All of the documents in this folder for you will be view only. So if you would like to make editable copies for yourself, you can either create copies and move them into your own Drive folder, or you can download these. So within this folder, there's a document called Workshop Practice Tasks. And if you open that document, you'll see that there's something called Practice Tasks Set Number 1, Vector Layer Querying and Analysis. So these are just some example tasks for you to do to explore some of the other QGreenland data layers using the processing toolbox. So feel free just to explore it on your own, or if you would like some guidance and some examples to play with, you can use these practice tasks. So again, we'll take about 5 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer. And then I'll come back and show you how to use some raster tools to analyze raster layers. Okay, I'm gonna move us forward. And if you haven't had time to complete these tasks or you do want to just kind of spend a little bit more time in them, this document will remain in that Drive folder after this workshop. And again, all those detailed instructions on how to do everything that we're doing here is in a different document that will also live in that Drive for you to access indefinitely. So you can feel free to go back and reference those documents at any time that you want. So the first two tasks listed here under this practice task set use the same tools that we have used in the examples already. This third one uses a different tool that's a pretty simple tool actually. So I just want to show you what that is. So this one is figure out the average area of ice sheet hydrologic basins in Greenland. And the hint is to use a tool in the vector analysis group in the toolbox. And you want to use the ice basins layer, which is in the hydrology group for this particular analysis. So the tool you want to explore this question is this tool called Basic Statistics for Fields. Again, pretty simple. We just want to put the input layer ice basins. And then within the ice basins data layer, there's an attribute for area, and that's what we'll want to calculate the statistics on. And when you run tools like this, the results actually show up in a different panel, the results viewer panel. So I'm just going to click on that. That'll open it for me in a web browser and show me the results for that. The one downside to this view is it doesn't tell you the units that these are in. I believe these numbers are square meters. I think Ken can probably correct me on this since I think this is one of his data layers. But what we're interested in is the mean value here. So that's how you would explore that question in that task. All right. Okay, so now I want to show you an example of how to analyze one of the raster data sets in QGreenland. So I'm just going to turn all of these bird layers off for now. And I'm going to close this results viewer just to get back to the processing toolbox panel. So the example that I want to show you using a raster tool, and I don't have a slide for it, so I'll just read you what the example is. So the question that we want to answer using a raster tool is, what is a good estimate of the Greenland ice sheet's volume? A lot of you might already know the answer to that, but we can easily find the answer to that using a single tool in the processing toolbox. So again, the question is, what is a good estimate of the Greenland ice sheet's volume? So I'll just say that the raster data set that we want to use for this is called ice thickness 500 meters. And I believe that, I don't even remember where that one is. If someone wants to remind me, if someone knows, maybe Matt or Trey, where that data set is, just go ahead and throw it in the chat box.
Glaciology.
Glaciology. Thanks, Vinton.
Sorry, I was distracted for a moment and I missed which data set you were looking for.
Oh, we're looking for ice thickness. Also, I think it's a better resolution than I just said too. Oh, thanks, George. Oh, thank you. Yep, that's what it is. Aha, terrain models there. I thought it was in the the glaciology too, one of the ice layers.
I forgot too.
Okay, so it's under a terrain models bed machine, the ice thickness, it's actually 150 meter resolution layer. So this is the layer we want to use for our raster analysis. And the raster tool that we're going to use is called raster surface volume, and that's underneath the raster analysis category in the processing toolbox. And our input layer here will be a little bit easier to find than it was in the layers panel. So again, we want ice thickness, 150 meter resolution. I'm going to leave these two things as is. This base level just means that we're interested in pixel values that are greater than 0. And the method is count only above base level because we're only interested again in pixel values greater than 0. And then I'm going to leave these as temporary file outputs. And again, with this, as with the vector statistics tool, we have a results viewer panel that pops up, and the surface volume report is what we're interested in. So I'll go ahead and open that. And this volume number is what will help us answer our question, which is a good estimate of the volume of the Greenland ice sheet. And again, this number is in cubic meters, I believe. So if we convert that to cubic kilometers, it's about 2.9 million cubic kilometers. So that's just what I love about QGIS and this processing toolbox is you can answer some really big research questions with a single tool, which is pretty neat. All right, I am going to give everyone about another 3 minutes or so just to explore the raster analysis tools in the processing toolbox. And if you want to use some of those just to do other raster analyses and some of the raster data sets in QGreenland, feel free to do that. About 3 minutes, and then we'll move on to editing, adding, and creating new data layers from scratch. Okay, so I'm going to move us on to creating, editing, and adding new data layers to your QGreenland project. And I do just want to thank everybody who is using the chat box to offer better, different ways to do things and solutions to problems that folks are having. And again, if you have questions or you're having any issues with any of these examples we're working through, definitely throw them in the chat box and we'll try to help you troubleshoot. All right. I'm actually going to close the processing toolbox since we aren't going to be using that for these next few examples, just to make my map view a little bit larger. And the first thing that I want to do is to show an example of how to edit an existing data layer in your QGreenland project. And the layer that I'm going to edit, and this one I actually know where it is the ice cores layer. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. That's within the glaciology group layer. And it's a point layer that shows locations of ice cores that have been extracted in Greenland and surrounding land masses. And I'm going to show an example of how to add a new data point to this data layer. So let's say, for example, that I went out and collected a new ice core, and I wanted to add that to this data set so that it's included within it. So the way that you can edit this data layer or any vector layer, the first thing you want to do is to highlight it in the layers panel. So I'm going to go ahead and click on it so that it's selected in the layers panel. And then I'm going to use one of my toolbars. So this is the digitizing toolbar. So if you don't have this toggled on, go ahead and add it to your toolbars. And currently the only button that I can select in that toolbar is the toggle editing button. So this is going to turn on editing for this particular layer. So I'll go ahead and click on that. And that'll make a lot of these other buttons accessible. So for this particular example, I mentioned what I want to do is add a new point to this layer. So I'm going to actually click on this button within the toolbar called Add Point Feature. And that'll bring up a little crosshairs on my mouse. And I'm just going to add the point here. So when I click, before it actually adds the physical point to my map view, it's going to make me create some attributes and name that particular data point. So I'm just going to add in, that'll auto-generate. I'm going to add in, give it a name. So I'll call it new ice core location. And then theoretically, you would want to fill in these attributes so that this record in the attribute table is complete. For now, I'm actually just going to leave them blank. And then click OK. And then once you do that, that new point should show up in your map view as part of that data set. So a pretty quick and easy way to add a point to that layer. And you can certainly delete it as easily as you can add it. But I do want to show you, since I left the attributes for that new data point blank, say I actually did want to go in and actually add attributes and edit the attribute table, you can also do that. So I'm going to right click on ice cores, open the attribute table for this layer. And because editing is still turned on for this layer, this attribute table should be editable to me. So I could find that new layer. Actually, this is one I created in the last workshop. Or you could search for it and find it. And then you could edit this entry in the attribute table and fill in all the attributes you didn't fill in initially. Be sure to save whatever edits you make if you want to before you turn editing off. So in this case, if I edited this attribute table, I would click the Save Edits button. I'm not going to do that now, but that's how I would do it. And then once you're done editing, you'll want to make sure to toggle out of editing mode just so you don't accidentally make any more changes to your data sets. So in this case, I could either click on the toggle editing mode button in my attributes table, or I could do it here in the digitizing toolbar, just toggle editing off. And it will ask you if you want to save your changes. I'm not going to save just because I don't want to overwrite this particular data layer, but that's how you would do it. Okay, so how would you create a new vector layer if you wanted to do that? It turns out the process has a lot of similarities to how you edit an existing data layer in QGreenland. So to create a new vector data layer, you'll want to go to, I'm actually going to create a shapefile layer here. You could create other types of layers. You could create a GeoPackage vector layer if you wanted to, but for simplicity, I'm going to create a new shapefile layer. And that's using this button here. And this is in the data source manager toolbar. So again, if you don't see these sets of buttons, that's because you need to turn that toolbar on. So I'll select new shapefile layer. And then I'll give the layer a name. I'm going to be super uncreative here and just call it new point layer. But for example, you might use this function to identify new study sites or new data collection sites. And then you'll want to make sure just to fill in these appropriate boxes and parameters up here. So if I wanted to identify new data collection sites, I'd probably want that to be a point vector layer. And then I'm actually going to change the coordinate reference system of that layer so it matches the coordinate reference system of all data layers in QGreenland, and that is EPSG 3413, which is the NSIDC sea ice polar stereographic north projection. And then of course, for any vector layer, we'll want to create an attribute table. So this bottom section here is where you can do that. So this is where you'd create new fields for that attribute table. So say, for example, I wanted to create a point layer of new potential data collection sites. One of the attributes I might want to include is the name of the different data collection sites. And that would, of course, be text data. And I'm just going to change this length so it's not quite so long. And then to add that field to your attributes table for this new data layer, you'll just click Add to Fields List, and it'll show up down here in your fields list. And then, of course, you could populate your attribute table with whatever other fields you want. That could be anything from string data, numbers, integers, or dates. Say you wanted to collect that data on a particular date, you could assign a date to then. Those data sets as well, or those data points. So I'm just going to leave this as is and click OK to create that new vector data layer. And that showed up over here in glaciology for me since I was last using the ice cores layer, so it was probably selected. But let's say that I don't actually want it to stay in this glaciology layer, and a quick and easy way to move a layer out of an existing group is just to right click and select Move Out of Group, and that'll just move it. And then the way to populate this new vector layer is actually exactly the same way you would edit a layer. So we would select it, we'd toggle editing on, and we'd start to add new data points and then save it. So I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to populate it all. In fact, I'm going to get rid of this just so it's not sitting in our layers panel. So I can just right click and remove the layer. All right, so we've edited an existing QGreenland data layer. We've created a new layer from scratch, which is very similar to editing a new data layer, a lot of the same functionality. But what if you wanted to add your own data layer, your own data set to your QGreenland project? How would you do that? So for this, There are a couple of example data sets that I've put into the Google Drive folder. So we'll use one of them together, and then the other one is for a practice task that you'll do on your own. So I just want to draw your attention to the folder within that main folder called Data for Adding New Layers Practice. There's a couple of things within that folder. The one we're going to use for this first example is in this folder called Potential Data Collection Locations Point File. So for now, you'll at least want to download the files that are in that folder, but you'll probably want to download all of those files that are in that folder. Oop. Yeah, so you'll want to download these three. So this is an example point data layer that I created. So this is just a made up layer. It's not an actual real data layer for Greenland. So this is an example of an existing point layer of potential data collection locations. And in this case, I created it as a geo package layer. So go ahead and download those. Save them to a location of your choice in your computer. So the way that we can add new data layers to our QGreenland project is using this Manage Layers toolbar. So for me, it's on the side here. And we can add a bunch of different types of data layers, but because the data layer we want to add is a point vector layer, I'm going to use the Add Vector Layer tool, which will bring up a window that allows me to find that file in my computer and upload it. So to do that, I'll just click on this button with the 3 dots next to vector data sets. And then I'll browse the location on my computer where that data is. In this case, we'll just choose the file with the GPKG extension, that's the geo package layer, and open it. And then add. I'm being pretty sloppy here in how I'm adding it to my layers panel. I'm not being very careful, and I'm making sure it goes to very intentional and logical places initially. So I'm actually just going to move this out of the regional climate models layer because that's not where I want it. And there we go. There's our new data layer. And of course, if you wanted to edit this data layer at all, remove or add points, you can do so as described earlier, as we practiced earlier with editing data layers. So that's a pretty simple example of just a very simple point layer, how to add a very simple point layer. But there are other data layer types that you can add. And I thought it might actually be useful for us to add an actual real data layer for Greenland to our QGreenland project. And so in that same Drive folder that I pointed to earlier, the data for adding new data layers practice, there's a folder called multi-layer mesh data. And there should be 2 different NetCDF data layers within that folder. And those are multi-layer mesh layers. So just to show you where those come from, I'm going to put this link in the chat so you can go to this page. This is the source for those 2 data layers if you want to get an idea of what they are. Multi-layer just means that we can download a single file, a single mesh layer will have within it multiple different layers that we can toggle on or off. And mesh layer is something that's pretty similar to a raster layer, but it doesn't necessarily have to have a regular grid. They can be a less structured grid. So we're going to practice adding these mesh layers to our QGreenland project. And I'm actually going to let you do that independently. So if you go back to our workshop practice task document, under practice task number 2, there are instructions for how to do this. So go ahead, download those layers to your computer. You can feel free to check out the data source page just to better understand what those layers include. And then follow the instructions for adding a mesh layer to your QGreenland project. I will say we already know from the chat that some people, if you're running Linux, you might run into issues with adding these mesh layers. If anybody else has a problem doing so, definitely let us know and we can help you troubleshoot that. So take about 5 minutes or so to add those layers to your QGreenland project. I see that these mesh layers are taking some time for some folks to load. They are large files, So I know for me, it took a minute for it to load, and I was a little worried that it was going to freeze my QGIS, but it didn't. So it might take a minute for you. I have heard a couple folks say, and I see Ken put this in the chat, that you could also load this as a raster. I've tried loading these mesh layers as a raster, and it won't let me. So if anybody does have tips on how to load it as a raster instead of a mesh, definitely throw that in the chat and let me and everyone know. So I loaded actually a different file from this data set, but yours will probably look similar. So this is, I think I loaded a file just from a different month. So this data set is monthly data. And I just want to show you what's kind of cool about these multi-layers. I'm going to open the layer properties for this mesh layer I just added. And if you go to symbology, this is how you toggle between which layers in this multi-layer data set you want to actually show in the map view. So currently what's being shown is monthly albedo. But I can actually go over here and click down the list, and that will change the layer that's visible in the map view. So I'm going to go ahead and change it to this ice surface temperature, and then click OK, and it should re-render in the map view to that different data set.